The budget process starts at the beginning of every year. It begins with the president proposing his version of a budget. President Biden, at the beginning of the year, proposed a $6.9 trillion budget. Now, it's time for everybody to take a nap. Okay? This is going to get really boring. So you may want to stop listening because it's going to get really boring. In the budget, there is what is called discretionary spending and mandatory spending. I hear these terms thrown around like I'm supposed to know what they mean. Some of you know what it means. And if you're like me, you once knew what it meant, you forgot what it meant, you looked it up, so you knew what it meant, and then you forgot what it meant, and then you looked it up again. It's hard to remember this stuff because the people in charge of the budget process don't want us to participate, so they keep it confusing. Let me remind us how the budget works. Let me go full screen here. The budget, is divided into 3 buckets. There's discretionary spending, mandatory spending, and then the interest on the bonds we sell to pay for the debt we accrue by spending more than the Internal Revenue Service was able to collect. 3 buckets. Are you awake? Everybody awake? Anybody still here? 3 buckets. There's discretionary, mandatory, and then there's the interest payments on the Treasury bills to pay for the budget deficit. Okay. Discretionary spending is what the fight over the budget is really about. Mandatory spending is mandatory. You can't fight about it. There's very little to argue. And the third bucket, the interest on the debt, that's got to be paid. Otherwise, our credit rating is destroyed and the government can't borrow any more money because nobody would buy our Treasury bonds, which are still considered the safest investment in the world. So this is what the 2024 budget is. 8% of the 2024 budget, if we spend $7 trillion in 2024, 8% of that goes towards paying the interest on the $33 trillion debt that we have. 26% of the 2024 budget would be discretionary spending, and 66% would be mandatory spending. Okay, let's talk about the first bucket. Wake up. Come on, wake up. The first bucket is discretionary spending. That is what we can spend with discretion. It's the spending you and I and our members of Congress and the president get to fight about. It's money spent at our own discretion. I'm helping you with a mnemonic now. Why is it called discretionary spending? Because we can raise and lower discretionary spending at our own discretion. Discretionary spending, however, also includes military spending, which, we all know that's not really discretionary. They say it's discretionary, but it's not. Whatever we spent on the military last year is automatically going to be spent again this year, and then you add another $100 billion or so. But they call it discretionary. But politically, we know there's no choice here. We know both parties are never going to cut military spending, but they call it discretionary spending. And that's part of the discretionary spending bucket. And inside that discretionary spending bucket, inside that discretionary spending bucket, we have 45% of that discretionary spending bucket is military spending. That would be the National Defense Authorization Act, which Congress is supposed to pass before the holiday break. It's one of the 12 appropriations bills that make up the 2024 budget. It's defense spending. It's a no-brainer. And it has to be passed before the holiday break because if Congress can't pass defense spending before Christmas, they're not going to be able to pass anything. So that's 45% of the discretionary spending, that's military. And right there, the arrow points to discretionary spending. That's 55% of discretionary spending is non-military. 55% of discretionary spending is non-military. And that right there is what all the fighting is about. What we spend on keeping the government running, paying the salaries of the millions of federal employees, or some call it the administrative state, that's the big monster Republicans want to dismantle. Non-military discretionary spending, 55% of discretionary spending. It's things like the EPA, the CDC, the NIH, the Department of Transportation, all the agencies that regulate, the FDA, the Department of Agriculture, all the millions of federal employees who make sure our food, drugs, and roads are safe. The people who warn us to get away from a hurricane. Republicans either want to get rid of that or defund it. The Justice Department, the FBI, and of course the Internal Revenue Service, that's all in that 55% discretionary bucket. That's the non-military bucket of the discretionary funding. So let's go back. Are you awake? You still believe in a democracy, or should we just go to fascism and not have to worry about this shit? So, of the 2024 budget, right, of let's say a $7 trillion budget, the argument is only over discretionary spending. See that? 26%. That's it. There's the mandatory spending, that's 66%. There's no argument there. And the interest is 8% of the budget. There's no argument there. The argument is over 26% of the budget, which is discretionary. And of the discretionary part of the budget, 45% is spent on the military and 55% is non-military. So nearly half of the 26% of the entire budget is military, 45%. And so all the fighting and the arguing right now is pretty much over the 50% of the 26% allocated for discretionary spending. So basically, we're arguing over about, let's say, 14% of the entire $7 trillion budget. The rest is spoken for. The military is non-negotiable. So they're arguing right now about 14% of the entire budget, because 66% of the entire budget is what is called mandatory spending. This is discretionary spending, but it's mandatory spending. Discretionary spending, mandatory spending. Now, the budget, are you awake? Everybody awake? Is anybody here? The budget process, the 12 appropriations bills that make up the budget, is for the most part fought out in the discretionary spending bucket. But discretionary spending, like I said, only makes up about 26% of the entire budget. So, where am I? The other bucket is the 8% for interest, and that I'll try to explain. We have a $33 trillion debt. So when we run budget deficits, when we spend more money than the Internal Revenue Service collects in taxes, we're running a deficit, which is different from the debt. We have a budget deficit. So to pay for what we don't have, we issue bonds to investors who buy those bonds. So they give our government cash buying those bonds, and then those bonds are added to our $33 trillion debt. But to get people to buy our bonds or our debt, we have to make it attractive to them. So we pay them interest, and that interest on the entire $33 trillion debt comes to 8% of our annual budget. Think of your credit card, okay? Over the years, I racked up $33 trillion in credit card charges, buying bridges, howitzers, and cures for COVID. 8% of, and I'm not paying off my $33 trillion credit card balance. So every year, 8% of everything I spend goes towards paying interest on my $33 trillion credit card debt. And then there's the discretionary spending. Is everybody still awake? Do you hate me? This is what's going on in Washington. This is what's going on. It's boring, but it's important. It's like, it's life or death. It is. It's life or death. So there's discretionary spending. That's there's discretionary spending. There's the interest on the debt. And then the last bucket is mandatory spending. So let me get to mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is spending that was ordered through previous legislation and must be paid each year. That's mandatory spending. That would be Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, SNAP. That would be the food stamps benefits, unemployment insurance, the earned income tax credit, and temporary assistance to needy families. That's all in the mandatory spending bucket. Mandatory spending is supposedly untouchable. It's considered the third rail. But Republicans are constantly trying to touch it. They want to cut SNAP benefits as well as temporary assistance to needy families. They will always fight cost of living adjustments on Social Security and are desperately trying to cut spending on Medicare, except when it comes to giving Medicare the power to negotiate drug prices. Republicans want to cut spending on Medicare, but they never, ever want to cut what Medicare overpays Big Pharma for the big ticket drugs, because Big Pharma is one of the Republican Party's biggest constituents. So that's mandatory spending, and that comprises 66% of our budget. That's the biggest chunk of spending, and they're really not arguing about that. And that's our budget. And right now, Congress can't decide what the top line will be on discretionary spending. Now, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, yeah, I'm going there. I'm really sorry. I am. Because this was like the fiscal responsibility. Remember the debt ceiling had to be raised in June, and we had to negotiate, and Biden and McCarthy, and the government was going to shut down, and everybody was going to get laid off, and we were going to default on the bonds. Remember that? I'm sorry, but we passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act back in June to lift the debt ceiling until January of 2025. And the Fiscal Responsibility Act from June, Republicans and Democrats agreed that congressional spending could blow past the $33 trillion debt we already owe, past the debt ceiling. But Republicans and Democrats agreed that discretionary spending for the 2024 budget would be roughly $868 billion for defense and $703 billion for non-defense spending in that bucket of discretionary spending, right? And so, according to the Fiscal Responsibility Act passed in June, discretionary spending, $868 billion for defense, $703 billion for non-defense. Depending on whether you're using a Democratic calculator or a Republican calculator, discretionary spending, the top line for discretionary spending, would be $1.6 trillion total if you're using a Republican calculator. If you're using a Democratic calculator, 1.7 trillion, 1.8 trillion. And that would be the top line for discretionary spending. What is the most we can spend this year is called the top line. And the 2024 budget was all ironed out in June with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, right? Which means the 2024 budget was supposed to be passed and initiated on October 1st of this year. Couldn't do it, even though we had a Fiscal Responsibility Act passed. Couldn't do it. So they keep passing these continuing resolutions while they still try to pass these spending bills, and yet they still can't agree on what the top line is. So no bills will be going into a conference committee before the Christmas holidays because they still can't agree on how much they're willing to spend. Now, if you're like me, if you're still awake, if you haven't unsubscribed to this channel, you hate this feculence. You're creative. You want to make things. You don't want to think about the costs. Your eyes are glazing over. My eyes are glazing over. It's like I'm directing a movie. I want to worry about the actors, the set design, the script, all the fun stuff that allows me to express my inner demons. Most people who go to Washington they want to do the culture issues, the big thing. They don't want to do the nuts and bolts of democracy, which is spending. What you spend defines who you are. What you spend money on defines your values. So, but you don't want to think about that because you're creative. You let the bean counters fight me, but keep them out of my way. Here's the thing, it's the evil bean counters, and most of them are evil, who decide how much of our money goes to schools and how much goes towards bombs we don't need. It's a matter of life and death. The bean counters get to decide who lives and who dies. And the bean counters want you and me, they want our eyes to glaze over. They want us to be confused. So they invent terms like discretionary and non-discretionary spending, mandatory spending. They have their own exclusionary language to lock us out, to make us feel stupid, to prevent us from saying, "Where's my money, Henry? I want my money, Henry. Where's my money?" Oh, Danny boy,